Editor's note: when Michael Ganger sent us this story last winter, he anticipated we might be skeptical of its authenticity, so he offered to provide a list of character references. He also offered, reluctantly, to reveal the exact site of the cabin where the incident occurred, but only if we assured him the location would never be made public. We didn't ask him for a map to the cabin, but we did take him up on his offer to provided references. When we contacted the people on his list, the tone of their replies encouraged us to publish the story. In our dealings with him, he has shown a high degree of integrity and reliability, wrote one couple. A man from a different part of the state told us, "I know him to be honest." Because he was alone in the old mining cabin, no one except Mr. Ganger could verify the truth of this story, and the author admitted he was still mystified, nor had others come forward with an explanation. To the best of his knowledge, no one had probed into that area since that harrowing night. If a reader were to enter that cabin, they could strike a match and light the same candles that burned during the incident. Michael Ganger won't be going back to try to solve the mystery. On May 21st, he was lost and presumed drowned in a rafting accident on the 40-mile river near Clinton Creek. He and 3 companions were floating in the high, ice-choked river when their raft overturned. 2 were able to make it to shore, but Mr. Ganger and 1 companion were never found. Some years ago during winter, I went out on trail alone, on foot, and over considerable distance. This was well before the pipeline and before the soaring gold prices of recent history. My journey was over what I thought to be familiar ground, for I had traveled the route before while prospecting during the mining season. But I was not prepared for the transformation winter had made upon the land, and sights familiar to me took on a new appearance when covered with snow. It did not seem necessary to take snowshoes. I would walk the entire way on the frozen river, and the snow was not excessively deep. After some debate with myself, I decided against bringing my rifle. I was well provisioned, and the only purpose would have been for protection against the numerous grizzly bears in that region. The temperature was hovering around 10 below zero when I departed. It is possible to find the odd bear out with temperatures as low as 20 below, and in the end, I compromised and took a revolver, a Colt Trooper 357 Magnum, and a dozen cartridges. A revolver is no match for that animal, but most bears can be frightened away by firing a shot over their head. I swashed it at night, sleeping beside my fire in the open, my down bag wrapped in canvas to protect it from sparks, and a thick piece of foam beneath me. Other than my clothing, I had no special winter equipment. There was no chance of meeting another person. The land was uninhabited and stretched empty more than 100 miles beyond my destination. 2 mountain ranges segment that distance. No one could approach from the direction I was headed, nor could the area have been entered before me. Because of the mountains parallel to the river, the only point of embarkation was the one I had chosen. The few residents living there, friends of mine, had told me no one had gone in before me. There were no trappers working in this remote region. If I had not had a reason for going to the place I was headed, I wouldn't have been there. I was totally alone. The old mining camp I was headed for was just a few miles short of my ultimate destination. The cabin at the camp was the only shelter within several days' walk. Without it, I would not have attempted this trip. At least I knew I would be safe and warm for the 10 days or so it would take me to complete my work. When I arrived at the cabin, a 2-day-old snowstorm was ending. That afternoon, as I stood in the cabin's open door, I savored the peace of the stark, utterly still landscape. I closed the door on the scene and sat by the crackling stove to smoke my pipe. Later in the day, the temperature again was plummeting. The new snow combined with the dropping mercury would be a deadly combination for any man out that night. I was proud of myself for traveling alone all this way on foot, but it had taken its toll. I was deeply exhausted. It was not sleep I craved, for I had fallen asleep a few hours earlier and awoke feeling perfectly refreshed. It was freedom from stress I needed. The most revitalizing thing I could do was sit in the chair beside the stove with smoke rising gently from my pipe. An ancient book dated 1880 from the cabin opened before me. A pot of tea simmered on the stove, and a freshly opened pack of pipe tobacco awaited my pleasure. As comfortable as my seat by the fire was, I felt the desire to stretch my legs and get a breath of fresh air. I had a taste for a strong cup of coffee, so I picked up 2 large pots to pack with snow for melting coffee water. I pulled on my shoe packs but did not don my parka, for my stay outside would be brief. As I stepped into the night and shut the door, the cold hit me like a slap in the face. The fresh snow highlighted everything. I walked a dozen steps from the cabin across the small clearing to the edge of the embankment, 15 feet above the river. On the slope, thick evergreens shielded the river from view. Each step produced a loud, curious mixture of crunching and squeaking, which disturbed the stillness of the night. Above me, the sky had cleared, and the stars twinkled brilliantly. It was so impressive that not until a chill penetrated my heavy wool shirt did I break away from my stargazing. I bent to fill the pots, my bare hand scooping the snow. As I straightened up with the snow-packed pots, it began. It was a faint sound, far upriver, from the direction I had been heading. I recognized it immediately, the breaking of one of the lower dead branches which ring the evergreens. It was impossible to not snap some of these branches when moving through a thick stand of trees. The sound caused me to pause for a few moments, long enough for it to repeat itself. Sometimes a bear will rub against trees and snap branches, but it was far below the temperature in which a bear might venture out. It could be a moose, but it is unusual to hear a moose snap a branch. My hands grew painfully cold while I stood silent, listening intently. There was no other sound. The night was still again. I hurried back to the warmth of the cabin. I was thoroughly chilled, and the fire beckoned strongly, but I paused at the door to listen again. All was silent. I entered the cabin and fed the fire, then huddled closer to the stove. The desire for a cup of coffee was even stronger now, and I waited impatiently for the snow to melt it. But more than once during the wait, my mind drifted back to the 2 faint sounds in the dark. What had caused them? Some old nerve lying long dormant had been sensitized and would not be still. I walked to the bed, got the holstered revolver, and hung it on a peg within reach. That small concession to the nagging question in my mind seemed to lay the matter to rest. The water boiled and the aroma of trail coffee blended pleasantly with that of the fire. I settled back to enjoy my cup, and had only taken the first sip when I bolted upright in my chair, spilling coffee into my lap. For a moment I sat rigid, staring at the wall without breathing, then slowly turned to face the door. That's where the sound had come from, loud and very close. The sound of a thick branch snapping. I stared at the door, my breathing shallow and soundless. More faintly, I heard twigs being broken. The sound came closer. Some large animal was walking up through the trees, approaching the cabin. I couldn't understand it. A moose wouldn't travel along the river. There were too many ice jams. Their paths were along the embankments and known to them even under this blanket of snow. Trance-like, reached out and placed the coffee cup on the table. My eyes never wavered from the door. Now I heard the peculiar crunch of snow as it compressed under heavy weight. It had to be a moose. The broad paws of a bear would not make that distinctive sound. The animal showed some caution, for there was a slight pause between each step, indicating an attempt to walk softly. But the steps indicated no indecision, for the animal's course took it across the clearing and unwaveringly to the door. It stopped just 2 feet short. I sat mesmerized, following the progress of the steps. Instinctively, I appraised the door. It opened out to prevent a bear pushing it in. It had no lock, but a latch raised or lowered a wooden bar, which secured the door by falling into a bracket attached to the frame. An animal couldn't operate the mechanism, even by pulling on the apparatus with its teeth. The handle used to pull the door open also served to shield the protrusion which operated the latch. The door itself was constructed sturdily of hand-sawn planking. I sat estimating its strength until I reminded myself I had nothing to fear from an inquisitive moose, yet it seemed so absurd that right on the other side of this door, within a few feet of me, stood a large animal staring at its side, while I stared at mine. Perhaps I'd just have a look at this most unconventional animal. I rose to do so, but never got the chance. And who can say what would have happened had I thrown the door open at that moment? While I watched in fascination, the latch quivered slightly, and the bar began to rise slowly and gently. It was a man, afoot on a night like this, and approaching from the very direction I had assumed it impossible for any man to come from. That he should come upon the cabin on such a night was indeed fortunate for him. I was glad there was coffee made, for I knew how appreciated it would be to this late-night traveler. There was absolutely no question but that we would share the cabin, and he would be most welcome to share in any provisions I could spare, or if his need was greater than mine, he would have whatever he needed at my own expense. I was mildly irritated at his lack of courtesy in failing to hail the cabin upon his approach or knock on the door, but these thoughts were underscored by the big question: where could he possibly be coming from? The bar reached its apex. I felt no fear, and had even begun to smile in greeting, but that smile never materialized, for neither did the stranger. The bar paused in its upright position for some seconds, then slowly began its descent. I nearly gasped, and I believe my jaw may have fallen open. The silent testing of the latch spoke of serious danger, while I believed the stranger about to pull open the door and enter. The thought of awaiting him with a revolver in my hand never crossed my mind, but now I blessed the impulse that had made me bring it within reach. My eyes never left the door as I reached out and slipped the handgun from its holster. Holding it at arm's length, I swung it slowly forward and leveled it at the door. I thought to blow out the candles, but reconsidered. If he were now to suddenly pull the door open, the light would be in my favor. Then I heard again the sound of his feet on the snow. He was heading for the window. The lay of the cabin was such that as I stood more or less in the center, facing the door, the one window was directly to my right. The small rectangular stove sat in the corner where the windowed wall met the front wall. The length of the stove ran parallel to the right wall, and its opening faced the rear of the cabin. In front of the stove door and a little to the center of the cabin stood the chair, its back almost even with the window. Beginning in the center of the window was the edge of the table, which stretched from there along the wall to the end of the cabin. The candles were all on the table, and along the left wall, opposite the window, was the bed with my empty sleeping bag stretched full upon it. The stranger's steps were now edging up to the window. He wanted to see if I was asleep or not. Quickly, I moved between the window and the stove and flattened up against the wall. Here, I would be unobserved. He could see the rear half of the cabin. He could see the bed, but I would be protected. My ear lay directly against the wall, and the sound came through distinctly. The stranger paused exactly opposite of me. I heard him brushing against the wall. Had it not been for a few inches of wood, I could have reached out and touched him. No doubt his face was within 12 inches of my own. For myself, I made no sound save the click of the revolver as I cocked the hammer. After a pause, the steps continued the short distance until they stopped at the edge of the window. On the table, my full cup of coffee steamed merrily. He now knew two things. I was in the forward half of the cabin, and I was aware of his presence. I also crept to the very edge of the window. No doubt his face was exposed in the candlelight, and were I to pop out, I would be face to face with my antagonist. But I could not do that, because I'd have to lean far over to use the revolver, and that would expose me dangerously. So I stayed where I was. If my nemesis wanted more information, there was only one way he could get it: move to the other side of the window and view the front half of the cabin. It was here that I planned to seize the initiative. He undoubtedly would duck beneath the window and crawl past. When he did that, I would step in front of the window with my revolver in hand, and the intruder in full view on the ground beneath me. At that point, with me in control, we'd proceed with more formal introductions. But wait, that wouldn't work. He'd never crawl past on his hands and knees. He'd lie on his left side and inch forward, his right arm free to use a weapon. I glanced quickly around the cabin for some clue to my next strategy. The coffee pot. It was nearly full and the black liquid churned at a slow boil. It would work. As he crawled past the window, I would take one quick step, grab the pot of boiling coffee, whirl and smash it through the glass right at him. The same coffee I was going to greet this man with would now blind him with dense clouds of steam as the water hit air more than 260 degrees below its boiling point. The whole setting was incongruous. To be battling for no reason, the only other man within several days, was absurd. It was like a joke, as though at any moment we'd both start laughing about the entire incident. But this was no joke. I had little doubt that I was in great danger. Outside, I heard his body scraping against the rough logs as he slid down the wall to a squatting or kneeling position. Sweat poured down me. My time was near, and by force of will I calmed my mind and prepared for the engagement. But then he straightened up again. I heard a tiny crunch of snow, then another. Why was he moving around in that spot so much? What was he doing? His body scraped against the logs again, and I knew he moved back to the edge of the window. I was concerned he was at the extreme edge of the glass, maybe slightly beyond it. My own eyes were held fast to the window. Breaking my gaze even long enough to blink seemed dangerous. I had to get a look at him, any kind of look. From my angle, I couldn't see out the window at all, my hand clenching the revolver. I began to bend at my waist away from the wall, and at the same time slowly eased my head forward. My head had not come close to the edge of the window when two loud, fast crunches of snow told me my antagonist had retreated rapidly away from the window. I was stunned. If he had been looking straight through the glass, he couldn't have known what I was doing. I hadn't moved forward enough to reveal my intentions. Clearly, he reacted to my movement. But how? I was completely off balance. A hole in the chinking. That must be it. He was looking through a hole. I thought myself into examining the packing between the logs, but I knew it was a waste of time. If there was a hole in the chinking, the draft from the fire would have pulled in the cold air in a steady, noticeable stream. I finished my futile search in a kneeling position. While still down on the floor, I put my ear to the wood. All was silent. I was perplexed. What kind of man was this? Did he read minds or just see through solid wood? Slowly, I began to rise to a standing position. I gasped, and in horror stood transfixed at the face which had materialized on the back wall of the cabin.